All resources for this episode are provided in the show notes. You're listening to Dare to Think, the official podcast of MereLiberty.com. This episode is brought to you by Mere Liberty Courses, teaching youth and adults the principles of thinking well through a holistic approach to the Socratic method. For more information and to see what students are saying, visit courses.mereliberty.com. I've recently been exploring the libertarian principle of self-ownership in greater depth. This axiom holds that no other human being has a higher claim on your body than you do. Libertarians use this to articulate human rights. But the implications of this principle go far beyond that. In this episode, I talked to Antony Sammeroff about questions related to that. Questions like, how have our parents affected our communication skills? What is people-pleasing, and how does this negatively impact us on a societal level? Is empathy a superpower or a wound? What's the difference between healing that wound and relieving our suffering from it? What does effective communication look like between two wounded people? Join me, Kerry Baldwin, with Antony Sammeroff as we dare to think about the implications of self-ownership in interpersonal communication. Today I'm speaking with Antony Sammeroff. If you're one of my libertarian listeners, you'll recognize Antony from his column at the Mises Institute and also his podcast, the Scottish Liberty Podcast. Today, though, we are not discussing libertarianism or economics, but relationships, specifically authenticity in relationships. As it happens, Antony's primary field of expertise is in psychology, right?
Well, I'm a therapist, so I guess that's applied psychology. I don't know what my primary field of knowledge is because I feel like these distinctions are really arbitrary. Like, I'm fascinated by economics, obviously, and I self-studied. I didn't do it academically, but there's so much psychology in economics. You know, even the idea that humans respond to incentives is a psychological proposition.
Sure.
And then there's so much economics and psychology, even though the psychologists don't realize it. I mean, behaviorism specifically, for example, talks about how people respond to incentives. More broadly than that, I remember reading the psychologist Carl Rogers, who's a humanistic therapist like myself. Reading his book on becoming a person, sometimes he had insights where I felt like I was reading Ludwig von Mises, like the economist. Like, they seem to be happening upon or pushing into the same insights. So what you could say is, I know I've come a long way from your original question, but what I think would be fair to say is my primary profession is as a therapist and psychologist. And although I'm more known for being a hobbyist economic journalist, although that's become partly a job as well, through happenstance. And that's my whole life story. You did ask me for a bio and I didn't send you one. So I guess that's what they get instead.
That's fine. That works. So you had made this post on Facebook a couple weeks back, and you'd posted one of your articles from Substack. I read it and thought that it would be interesting to have you on because I think, like you, the work that I do, the research that I'm focused on, it's sometimes about libertarianism itself as a philosophy. And, certainly I'll talk on economics too, but I really like talking about the implications of these ideas.
That's right.
Particularly recently, I've been talking and writing a lot about the principle of self-ownership and the implications for that in various relationships, friendships, marriage, that sort of thing. And so at any rate, I thought it would be really interesting to have you on because you seem to be doing a similar thing in looking at the implications of these ideas. So why don't you tell me more about what it is that you are aiming at, not just with this article, but more generally as well?
Well, I've always been fascinated by communication skills or communication. I guess maybe it was a little bit pernickety at first. I was holding myself to very high standards in terms of my communication because I was a little bit of a, or a lot of a people pleaser. I was really worried about doing something wrong or saying something wrong. So becoming precise in my words, but everything has a prior cause. Like, I mean, even that in itself, I grew up in a household with a very critical parent. My parents were always arguing. Another reason why I was interested in communication, because I saw it done badly. And even it was the criticism, I think, and the constant fault finding at home that made me become a perfectionist, because that's just self-criticism, isn't it? Perfectionism. At least it starts with that. The gift in that is I'm very good at hair splitting and being precise, and that comes very useful when you're writing about stuff like economics. But it also meant that I'd start to formulate ideas about communicating and really get the strands together and categorize things. Okay, so when I was in my 20s, I picked up the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, a very influential book. And that kind of blew my mind. And I read another book on communication skills called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. And that had a lot of really great communication skills in it, not just for dealing with children, but for dealing with adults who are basically grown up children. So from that, I kind of got this obsession with communication skills, and I'd watch YouTubes on it, and I'd start practicing these techniques. And when I practiced them, I learned things. In fact, it was practicing them that led me to want to become a therapist. So I'd learned things that other people hadn't written down. And then I'd start to type them up or go make a YouTube video. And I kind of like batted backwards and forwards through in and out of being like interested in writing about it and not. And I've got a lot of unpublished stuff on communication skills, and every now and then I feel like picking one of them up and expanding on it and something like that. And I'm sure they will one day be collected, a bunch of it in a book. In fact, I've written quite a lot of it. If the book ever does see the light of day, it will be over 10 years in the making. It will be made up of a lot of pieces that would stand on their own. And I guess this was kind of written because it was hot, My Substack is psychosocial.substack.com. I intend to use it more and more in the future.
There's so much that I could play off of there.
Please do.
You had mentioned there at the very beginning was, your experience with toxic family relationship at home. The first question I want to ask you is, as a therapist, how frequently do you run into people who have had similar experiences with childhood?
I don't know exactly where the lines in similar is. I mean, everyone seems to experience some level of neglect. A lot of people experience abuse. One thing in my profession is you're often confronted with people that remind you of how good you had it. But then a lot of people who think they had it good, it's only because they don't have anything to compare it to. One of the heartbreaking things about, I think one of the reasons why people avoid reading books like How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk is not just because it puts responsibility on them to be a better parent, because now they know they could do better than they're doing. But I think it's because it triggers up the pain of not having been treated well. And we live in a society where most people are kind of living in a dream world where they pretend that their childhood is better, or they might not even know. They can't even pretend, because it's not even in their level of awareness that they actually found growing up quite a struggle. They didn't get the quality of attention they need. Adults were condescending and patronizing to them. They did punish them instead of trying to understand what motivated their behavior. Their needs and preferences were disregarded. They were patronized. They were left to deal with things on their own when they really needed guidance and so forth. And that is the norm. That's not even talking about people who were severely abused or neglected, that's the kind of childhood that most people have.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary called The Wisdom of Trauma, and the primary person that they were sort of highlighting in that documentary was Dr. Gabor Mate. I don't know if
Oh
you're
yeah,
familiar
he's
with him.
great.
Yeah, that documentary was so eye-opening for me because he talks about how the negative things that we're having to deal with in our culture stem directly from trauma, specifically childhood trauma. And even he points out this isn't about abuse. Like, he makes a distinction between abuse and trauma. He says trauma is not being hurt, it's being alone with your hurt.
Oh
What
wow, that's a beautiful qualification.
Yeah. So, but he also says it's endemic in our society. So, all of the addiction we're dealing with as a society, the depression, the divorce rate, like all of these things are all symptoms of an endemic of trauma that goes back to childhood. And it can be, like you said, it doesn't have to be abusive per se. It can just be a place, our parents aren't perfect. And so it can just be a place where our parents failed to see where they needed to provide something and just didn't even know any better. That has an impact on us. And of course, that can go all the way up into chronically abusive or neglectful situations. But it does seem to be much more commonplace. In fact, Dr. Mate has published a new book, or is going to publish a new book that's coming out in February, I believe, The Myth of Normal. What we
Right.
think, the thing that we think of as normal is not actually normal.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, and it does cast a shadow on communication because people are triggered into defensiveness, for example, even when someone's being polite and conciliatory, because it's triggering up old traumas. Like, if you're criticized a lot, well, maybe you become resilient to criticism, or maybe you become hypersensitive. It just really depends on how your personality interfaces with your experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people beat around the bush, and they're people pleasers and things like that, and they might think they're being nice, for example, but other people think, would you just get to the point? Or they read that behavior as having low self-esteem, and they judge that person unfavorably, even though they're trying to ingratiate themselves, or because they ingratiate themselves. And where did they pick up that habit? Mm-hmm. It's because they were walking on eggshells earlier on in their life. Or maybe someone learns to be super aggressive and verbally aggressive, or portray a very forward attitude because the only way that they learned to get their needs met was to muscle in. And, maybe they benefit from that in some ways because the kind of more placating people give them a break or let them in front of the line. But as a consequence of that, they also miss out on intimacy or something like that because they don't really know how to connect with someone other than to intimidate them. For example, I'm using extremes. People come all along a spectrum, and it's not just one spectrum, like from 0 to 100, but it's several spectrums that intersect. And another challenge is people think the way that they communicate, oh, that's just how I am. That's just me. Mm-hmm. So when they try some new technique, they think, oh, it doesn't feel like me. It doesn't feel authentic. Right. Mm-hmm. But why does what you do feel authentic to you, especially if it doesn't get the results you want? It's just because it's what you're used to. And then there's another level of complicatedness on top of that. If you're confident using a certain communication style, then it works. But if you're not confident using it, it doesn't work. So if you're in the people pleaser style and you try and be more assertive, what you find is you get worse results than when you're a kiss ass. And you're like, well, I don't want to do this assertiveness thing because people challenge me when I'm assertive. But it's because they pick up on the fact that you're not confident being assertive yet. And the only way to get confident, that's why people stay in that box. Because the only way to get confident is to practice. But at first, when you practice, things are going to fall. It's like you've been playing the piano wrong because you've been teaching yourself. Then you go to piano lessons and the teacher shows you that your hand position is wrong, but you've not mastered this new hand position. Mm-hmm. So whenever you try and play the stuff that you used to play, you can't play it anymore. Right. And you think, well, this is stupid. But then when you try and play hard music more advanced than what you're used to, you'll find you can never play it with your
Mm.
old hand position. The only way that you'll be able to play difficult music is by correcting your bad habits.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to busk it and to play with your wrists sagging when you're playing something easy.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for everything, obviously, guitar, for anything that requires skill. Okay, you might get away with doing bad habits, but if you want to play at an advanced level, you can't have bad habits. If you want to have extraordinary relationships, it requires extraordinary communication skills.
Yeah. So, well, let me ask you this, because, it seems like, first of all, everybody requires relationships, right? On one degree or another. And libertarians often get accused of being atomistic in their
Right.
individualism. And it's like,
That
no,
old one, not that old one again.
yeah. Of the libertarian thinkers that I'm aware of, none of them actually believe that we're our own private islands. Like, we need each other. That's the only way that any of our principles can actually play out.
Well, the principles are for living in community. If you go and live in a desert island on your own, what the hell relevance is the NAP? None.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, we've got these principles because we know that an individual must enter a society. We always get these crazy straw man argument about what individualism means.
It also has a tendency to ignore the fact that, various communities in themselves are real and important things, like family, for example. Yeah.
Your Rotary Club, your church society, your chess club, your whatever you're into, your salsa class. I mean, it's not going to be really much of a salsa class if you turn up and there's only one of you.
Yeah. So I think it's really good that we're talking about this, because, and maybe libertarians are terrible about talking about community just because, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Dare to Think. My mission with this podcast is to challenge and rethink our paradigms for politics, religion, and culture. My goal is to bring you high-quality content that encourages you to do the same. I provide a ton of free content, but it's only possible by those who've joined my efforts by becoming monthly members. Monthly members get exclusive rewards, including access to a members-only forum, discounts on any of my web courses, and live quarterly Q&As. For a limited time, I'm also giving away a free signed copy of the new book I co-authored with the guys from the Libertarian Christian Institute called Faith Seeking Freedom: Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. You don't want to miss this. You can join for as little as $4 a month. This allows me to produce this content full-time. For more information and to join, visit mereliberty.com/membership. Now let's get back to the episode. So you're talking about communication, but I want to talk a little bit about this idea of people pleasing or placating.
Yeah, I prefer people pleasing. Sometimes they use the term fawning. I'm just going to be really colloquial because that's the easiest way to get ideas across.
Sure.
I kind of call it like sucking up to people to stay out of trouble. Being nice, even when you don't feel nice. There's a wide range of people pleasing behavior, agreeing to things that you don't want to do, eliminating the word no from your vocabulary, doing things you don't want to do, not just agreeing to things you don't want to do, blaming yourself when other people are being aggressive, verbally aggressive towards you, always making sure everyone else's needs come first and never having your own needs met, even if it means you're going to be resentful either, rationalizing away all your legitimate feelings about being taken advantage of. I'm sure that everyone can think of a zillion people-pleasing behaviors, sometimes alternatively called being a doormat. I don't have an exhaustive list. I think people know what we're talking about.
Most of my listeners know that I'm divorced from an abusive marriage. And one of the first books that I read after I separated was a book called Who's Pulling Your Strings by Dr. Harriet Breaker. So she talks about people-pleasing in that book as sort of symptomatic of toxic, manipulative sorts of relationships. But she also talks about how a people pleaser is someone who tends to not have a good sense of self.
Okay, I agree.
Yeah. And so she talks about something called the vanishing self, whatever it is. And maybe you don't even get a chance to get to know who you are even, right? This I'm sure goes back to childhood. But one of the reasons why somebody might become a people pleaser is because they have no real sense of their own personal identity.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time it kind of happens when people are in a situation where they chronically, over weeks, months, years, when they're growing up, are exposed to someone or more than one person that they really need to placate in order to survive in their formative years, whether it's a caregiver or parent or the atmosphere in boarding school, or they learn to be highly tuned in to the emotions and the needs of other people around them. And they associate it feels very threatening for anyone else to be displeased with them. So they never want to displease anyone. They learned that earlier on. Now, what I say in the article, of course, is there's nothing wrong with caring for the emotions of others.
Right. Yeah.
Right? That's a good thing.
Yeah.
But the question is, where do you put it in your hierarchy of values?
Yeah.
Are you willing to just want the approval of others at all costs, even at the cost of your authenticity? Are you going to sacrifice your self-respect to gain approval all the time? It compounds because you're training people. You're training people to have an expectation on you that you always come last. And then when you try and break out of that role, they're not going to like it because they're used to you behaving that way. And you're going to get way more pushback than you would have if you just drawn the line early on. This is a very sad state of affairs to be trained into, because it's not just that you're dealing with the fact that you're a people pleaser. In fact, when you try and climb out of it, you're terrified of being verbally attacked. You've been conditioned to be terrified of it. Not only that, when you try and break out of the old pattern, you will attract being verbally attacked at a higher rate than an average person exhibiting the same communication skills as you. Plus, that will continue to happen until you get more confident at asserting yourself. So it does present a raft of challenges for people.
I mean, it happens not only, and you mentioned this in your article, this isn't just like romantic relationship, it's any relationship. And one thing that I noticed in particular with past couple of years with COVID and all these lockdowns and nonsense and stuff is that people couldn't say no to these requirements. And I kept...
that's a good point. I never thought of that.
Yeah.
We're seeing it at large.
On this side of sort of studying manipulative relationships and abuse and that sort of thing, and what the symptoms are, what it looks like when you are the one who's being manipulated. And I saw all of those in the pandemic. If you were in a personal...
Wow. Have you been speaking about this in your podcast?
Not as much as I probably should.
That's such a great angle.
Yeah.
I never even thought of that when I wrote my Placating People article, but it would be so good if you used your expertise on that from firsthand experience to analogize. Yeah. Because that's really good.
On the one level, it's the capitulation of people to this
I like that word.
to this sort of tyrannical thing. But the reason why people are capitulating in the first place is because they have these problems in other aspects of their lives, right?
For sure.
But we can't actually deal with the tyrannical aspect until we deal with it with ourselves in our own personal lives.
I'm in complete accord with you on that. I really do think that politics is a big projection. It's interpersonal politics on the world stage. The kind of political manifestations we have in society are like a projection of people's unconscious material. I mean, what is your first exposure to authority? It's your parents. So it wouldn't be very surprising if we get our ideas on what authority should be from our parenting styles. And there's some evidence of this. I mean, Lloyd de Moss, sadly deceased, charted different societies through history and related them to the parenting styles of the generation just before that society. For example, Germany had very retrograde parenting styles compared to the rest of Europe just before Hitler came to power and things like that. So yeah, I definitely think people get the government that, not that they deserve, but that they expect, And we have created the society of people pleasers. So it wouldn't be surprising in the same way that people pleasing people often attract a partner with narcissistic tendencies would live in a society where their politicians were very domineering. In Scotland, the government's a very completely nanny state government. Well, you can't even look at what cigarettes are on offer in a shop anymore. They have to be hidden. You can't ask for the price of them. Someone needs to give you a price list. They won't tell you the price if you say, what's the cheapest pack of cigarettes? They put minimum prices on alcohol. But the thing is, people have an expectation in Scotland that the government is going to be their mum. And that's what they got. We've got a female leader who's been in power for, I think, almost 10 years. And as far as she's concerned, she's Scotland's mum. And a lot of people said she sounded like a dictator over this COVID stuff. She's wagging her finger on television at the people, telling them that they're being very naughty for not complying with COVID regulations. It's not particularly relevant that they're female, that she's female, apart from the fact that it really seems like in this case, the people don't want the state to be their strict dad.
Right.
It's not like that. It's like they want mum. They want the state to give them their lunch and their dinner and to clean their clothes for them and all of that stuff. They really do want to be taken care of in that way. And it's a crazy psychological phenomenon, what we see.
Well, and I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about the Oedipal mother is somebody who does for her children what her children should do for themselves.
Right. And we have a lot of that.
Such that there's now a toxic dependence of the children on the mother, and the mother wants it. She's not willing to let her children go and grow up and be adults.
Right.
And I know exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about Scotland, because in my home state, New Mexico, our governor, every time she did a press conference, I actually had to stop listening to it because it sounded a little bit too much like my ex-husband.
Crazy.
But she literally sounded like a resentful mother who hated her children and hated the fact that she was a mother. A lot of finger wagging and you're not doing well enough and this is your fault. And if you just obey me and do what I say, then, all of that nonsense.
Yeah, we have that a lot.
And you're right. I wouldn't say that that's particular to females.
But there seems to be a stereotypically female style of authoritarianism and a stereotypically male style of authoritarianism.
Yes.
And that's why I brought it up, because she seems to fit the mold of that. And she's become she was already authoritarian before all this, but she's become more aggressive with it. The First Minister of Scotland.
One of the things you say is you should be very suspicious when anyone self-identifies as an empath or highly sensitive person. You say, because in my experience, this is a defense they developed to cope with abusive behavior from a caregiver and a child. This is something that I noticed straight off the bat after my divorce. All of these articles saying, oh, if you're an empath, you're going to be attracted to a narcissist. And here's what you should do about that. And it's like, maybe this isn't something to be proud of.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I made that point. Again, it's an unfinished article I had somewhere where I was just raging at the fact that all sorts of people were on Facebook going, I'm an empath, as an empath, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, these people, they were driving me crazy, because I am, by their definition, an empath. And that's how I end up being a therapist. And it's very useful. Well, it's useful for me. It's not useful for them, because they've not identified it as a consequence of trauma.
Right.
Whereas I have, which means I can use it in my job to be extremely understanding of people and to help give them a level of empathy that they'll find nurturing and healing. But it's a wound. It's like someone came over with a big pair of boots and stamped in you, and you've got an imprint in your body that matches their boots, right? So where their boot impacted you, you have a boot-shaped hole.
Right.
And that's why you keep on getting attracted to people who mistreat you. Right. Because your boot-shaped hole fits their boot like a lock and a key.
Yeah.
And until people stop going, I'm such an empath, like, like this is a badge of honor that they're wearing, and start going, well, I learned to be highly sensitive to other people's emotions because I don't want to hurt their feelings, because when I was a kid, I had to walk on eggshells. And if I said the wrong thing, I was going to get attacked by one of my parents.
Right.
That's maybe a more useful thing to say than I'm an empath.
Yeah.
Like, people need to get over themselves. It's like you create this, you even create this identity around being an empath because, like you said earlier on in the conversation, you lack a strong sense of yourself. So you need to create this identity to base your self-esteem on, but it's not yourself. It's an identity you've created. And until you stop having this false identity as your source of worth and just see your source of worth as intrinsic, it's going to make it difficult for you to heal.
When I was reading these blog articles and social media posts, I thought, this is your vulnerability. Like this is what exposes you to these toxic relationships. Right. This is a place where you should be aware of why it's there and create a boundary for yourself. And you speak about boundaries too. I'm not sure exactly how you define a boundary, but I've always understood a boundary as a rule that I follow for myself. It's not a rule I place on others in my relationships. It's a rule that I follow. I decide, okay, this is something that I need to work on, and so I'm going to start doing X instead of Y or whatever. It seems to me that this glorifying these vulnerabilities, these things
glorifying a wound.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Glorifying a wound keeps you from being able to create a boundary necessary for your own, your own health.
That's right.
What I've noticed with people is once they learn that they have a trauma that causes them to get triggered in some way, it's very easy to sort of say, well, this is the one part of myself that can't be healed. I wonder if what you think about that. Can traumatized people be healed?
Well, I mean, it's a lifelong process, isn't it? What does healed mean? Can people get better than they are? Sure. I mean, I don't want to be healed of my increased capacity to empathize with others because it's useful for my profession. I maybe want to be healed of my suffering. I want to be healed of, say, feeling ashamed when I say something, when I tell a joke in company and no one laughs. Why do I need to feel such excessive shame? It's something from the past being triggered. So yeah, I mean, people can get a lot better, but it's a bumpy ride. I mean, I know some people who've got so much better than they were when I knew them years ago. They're happier, their communication's better, and yet they still go into downwaves and they feel tremendously depressed or anxious. I remember the last time I felt depressed. It was after I got COVID for about a week after I felt tremendously depressed. And that was the first time I felt that low in ages. But it used to happen regularly. And I would think, damn, I've put all this work in my whole life and I still feel this bad. What's the point? I'm never going to be cured. I'm never going to be healed. And it's not until you get out of that slump that you can see again how much progress you maybe have made on day-to-day things, that you take for granted. So there's always room for improvement in some areas. And a lot of it's getting better at being a friend to yourself, essentially.
That's really good. One of the things that I've come across in numerous places, unrelated except that they're talking about relationships, is that the best way to improve a relationship is to work on yourself.
Right.
It tends to be counterintuitive, at least for perhaps the traumatized person, because
especially the person who's used to putting the other person first.
Yes, but that's not true. That's not the way it is. The reality is that it starts with you, and that requires building just building some self-awareness, being reflective of what you're experiencing and perhaps why. And that can be daunting for people who've never done it before. There are people that I know who might enjoy, hearing what I have to say on a topic, but they don't want to think about it with regards to themselves.
I hear you.
Right. There are closer relationships, friendships where I'm aware of the fact that they can be triggered in a particular way, and I want to be sensitive to that. But there's a difficulty there. Like I was reading this book that talked about something called the fear-shame cycle. And it was discussing specifically romantic relationships, but I think this could be true of platonic relationships as well. When somebody experiences fear, and she argued that it was women who experience fear or insecurity, if they react from that, then it can elicit shame in her male partner, which if he reacts, then it just triggers more fear or insecurity in her, which if she reacts, then it triggers more shame. And it's sort of this like downward spiral. But I guess I'm wondering, because you mentioned communication, she was sort of the opinion that you don't talk about your fears or insecurities, or what shames you or whatnot. But I'm kind of wondering, how do you communicate then? Somebody's insecurities can elicit shame in another person.
Well, there's communication skills that are useful for dealing with that kind of thing as well. I've got a few podcasts on that. One's called Do You Really Understand People? Again, coming back to the sort of empath thing, your ability to hold presence for other people's reactions to what you say. I love the picture of a knight. It's such an ancient archetype for us. He's always depicted with a sword and a shield. And I feel like that's relevant to so much in life. So, you've got your sword, which is your ability to say what it is you have to say. But you don't go out without your shield either. And there's a shield, which is to demonstrate understanding. When you experience someone in conversation, whatever the reaction is, you always have the option to try and communicate something of what you understand of what they've said back to them. And this, I feel like, was the approach that was really refined and introduced to us all by Carl Rogers. He talked about it a lot, and he helped contribute to making it the norm throughout psychotherapy, regardless of what people's modality are. Our first tool is to demonstrate something of what we've understood of where the other person is coming from. And that melts resistance a lot of the time, as far as it can be melted. I'm not saying there's going to be I can't promise 100% results. There may just be some people who just don't have what it takes to engage in authentic relationships or emotionally open relationships. And maybe they will join together with someone who has a sort of complementary dysfunction. Either both of them don't talk about it and don't feel, and sometimes some people don't feel the need to talk about it. That's the thing. The problem is if you feel the need to have things out in the open and the other person doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that can happen is that person partners together with someone who does, and the other person does all the talking and they do all the listening, and these like, that can happen. And if it's stable, then it may actually work better than some relationships where people have to hash it all out.
Right.
Maybe until kids come along and the kids have different needs, and the kids don't like the fact that no one explains anything to them, and mom and dad never express their feelings and things like that. And it might cause problems for the kids sometimes, but it doesn't cause any problems for the adults. But I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, and my own experience says that really depthening and broadening your communication skills, your ability to receive others, as well as your ability to express yourself well and sort of master yourself in situations, has led to me having tremendous relationships. So I guess that's why I'm an advocate of it.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking with you, Antony, and we've got some things that I can put down in the show notes when we get that published.
Thank you for your great questions and your curiosity. I'm afraid I dominated and did most of the talking.
Oh, it was lovely. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Well, I look forward to speaking to you more and hearing more from you in the future. Thanks so much for having me on, Kerry.
Yes, most definitely. Thank you.
You've been listening to Dare to Think, the official podcast of mereliberty.com. This episode was created due to the generous support of my patrons and underwriters. I'm so very grateful to Bob, Patrick and Shannon, Dave and Nina, Jean, John, Tom, and my newest patron, Nathan, for helping me get this episode published. If you've enjoyed today's episode and would like to join me and my other patrons and underwriters in our effort, you can sign up at mereliberty.com/membership. Joining on a monthly membership comes with exclusive rewards and premium content. Alternatively, you can choose a one-time donation. You'll find a direct link to the membership page in the description to this episode. You can listen to more episodes by subscribing on virtually any podcatcher, and you can read my articles on mereliberty.com and the Libertarian Christian Institute, where I'm a regular contributor. You can follow me on social media like Facebook, Twitter, Minds, and Locals.